So welcome to day 2 of the OAIA 2024 conference. I'm going to start calling people out by name over there, Lewis. Impact and environmental assessments. It's a lot, and we can get great things done. So I'll start with the land acknowledgement. The Ontario Association for Impact Assessment acknowledges that our meeting is taking place on the treaty land that is steeped in rich First Nation history. We also acknowledge that this land is the treaty and the territory and treaty lands of the first people of Turtle Island. It is shared between the Mississauga of the Credit, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, and the Haudenosaunee, and is home to many diverse First Nations people. We acknowledge their generations of stewardship and strive to have a relationship with this land as they did, and reverse the impacts created by our ancestors in modern-day policy and processes. Today, we acknowledge our shared responsibility for caring for this land that we depend on to nourish our spirit, our bellies, and our minds. We commit to working together and respecting the beauty, safety, and security this land provides. We will act as partners in preserving this land together with the animals and habitats that depend on it for generations to come. On a personal note, I'd like to reflect about my personal relationship with the land. So I grew up not far from here, and when I was little, I would always sneak down to the Hubbard when I told my mom I was actually going to the park to play, and we would wade through the water. And I just remember that sense of like happiness and calm. And that's what I'd like you to think about is we all probably joined this industry because of that love of the land, the water, and just that making that connection again, getting out of our offices and remembering that is the purpose of our work, just touching the land, feeling the water, and understanding that calm and happiness that it brings us internally. OAIA acknowledges the forest past and current actions of settlers that have unwillfully created the foundation of the Canadian society today. We are dedicated to honoring First Nations history, culture, and most importantly, treaty. OAIA is committed to moving forward in truth and understanding the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations. So this is our program at a glance today. If you weren't here yesterday, then you won't know that the QR code for your program is on the back of your name tag, and that'll be the full program and list of speakers. So we encourage you to go there and check out the bios and the list of speakers. So we'll be doing sessions 5, 6, and 7 today with our Catherine. Catherine will be our moderator lead. Also, after lunch, we'll be having a chat with Gary Pritchard. A few of us were fortunate to go on an Indigenous oral history walk this morning, and so we'll be inviting Gary up here later to just talk about a little about that walk and the messaging that was shared during that. We'll have some closing remarks from the president, and we'll finish off with an elder traditional closing so that we can close the circle that we opened yesterday. So OAIA is led by a group of dedicated volunteers. I guess I'll ask the board to stand up and put them on the spot here. So we represent a diversity of industry experience from approvals, regulatories, practitioners, consultants, and government. Our collective jurisdiction crisscrosses Ontario, and we volunteer for a 2-year term with elections in December. So take a good look at these guys because I'm going to go to the next slide. You guys can sit down. We're looking for new members. Membership starts January 1st, 2025. If you do decide to become a board member, you will help guide OAI's mission to promote sound decision-making through the practice of impact and environmental assessments. So to be a member, we ask that you are a part of our membership, and you need to commit to at least 6 meetings. Meetings are held virtually every Tuesday, the first Tuesday of every month during the lunch hour. So if you are interested, come find one of those board members that you saw stand up, ask them about what the role means, have a chat with them, and we can talk to you a little bit more about some of the committees that we also sit on. And expect an email to come through soon with a formal request for resumes. We couldn't do this conference without our sponsors. So I want to thank all of our sponsors. At the Indigenous level, we have Hatch. The gold level, Stantec, Jacobs, HDR, and TRCA. Silver, GHG, Dillon, Minogue, William and Shire. At the bronze level, we have WCS, UBC Kier, Parsons, Arup, and Intrinsic, and our break sponsor, Hardy Stevenson and Associates. Thank you so much. Each year, the OAI, in lieu of a speaker's gift, does a donation to an organization that aligns with our missions and our goals. This year, we have donated $500 towards the work of Eco Schools. Eco Schools supports environmental leadership and climate action in schools, and their programming is free. So before we move on into our sessions and our presentations, I'll ask you guys to just scan the QR code. And if you were here yesterday, remember we had a couple Slidos asking about your experiences in impact and environmental assessments. It's our 30th year anniversary this year, so we're hoping to celebrate by learning a little bit more about the collective work that we do, and hopefully that we inspire others in the room. Just so you know, this is anonymous, but we will be using this information on our website in some form in the future. So your first question is, during your professional career, which assessment process did you think was the most innovative and why? So we're looking for your name, your project name, I said it was anonymous, the years you worked, the location, what was innovative about that, what was the driving force behind those innovations. So I'll let you guys sit with those answers as we just go on to some housekeeping. So the bathrooms are just past registration, down the hall, and then to the left after the two little stairs. In the case of an emergency, the fire exit is outside the doors to your left, and just continue to follow the exit signs. If you're looking for the Wi-Fi password, it is impact. And we also ask you that if you're taking pictures and posting it, if you can hashtag us, OAIA 2024, and follow us on all the regular socials, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So at this time, I'm going to call up and introduce you to Catherine Gentile. Catherine is a member of the board of directors and is also the sponsorship and moderator conference committee leads, and Catherine will begin our sessions.
Good morning, everybody. If I haven't met you before, Catherine Gentile, nice to meet you. You got to put that Italian flair on the last name, Viola. So I wanted to start by thanking our Session 5 gold sponsors. We've mentioned them before, but we're so grateful for all of their support: Stantec, TRCA, Jacobs, and HDR. So maybe we'll jump into things. And Paula, if you wanted to join me up here as moderator. This is the session that I've been looking forward to the most. A lot of people have alluded to all of the changes going on in our industry from a legislation perspective. So to have people in this session here to sort of speak to some of that is really exciting. And here's Paula.
Hello, thank you.
Should be ready to go when they come up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. If I could please call up Terence Hubbard, please, Peter Brown, and Dilek Postacioglu. Great, thank you. So I guess the first session today is to speak, and actually I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Paula Honer. I'm with Stantec Consulting Limited. I'm really happy to be here today and see all of these new and familiar faces. So it's been a great session so far, and welcome to day 2. So thank you. And Peter and Dilek, I didn't actually have a chance to meet you yet, so thank you for coming up today. Thank you. That's good. So the first session is going to be speaking to the changes to the federal impact assessment. So I'll introduce Terence. Terence was appointed president of the Impact Assessment Agency in 2021. In his role, he is responsible for leading all reviews of major projects under the Impact Assessment Act in cooperation with other Government of Canada regulatory agencies, as well as provinces, territories, and Indigenous groups. Prior to joining OAIA in 2018 as Vice President of Operations, Terence was Director General of the Petroleum Resources Branch with Natural Resources Canada. In his role, he had responsibility for Canada's oil and gas policy, as well as serving as Canada's representative on the governing board of the International Energy Agency. He's a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, where he obtained both his Bachelor and Master of Arts degrees in economics and now lives in Ottawa. So welcome, Terence. The second session I'll also just mention now as well. It's an update on Ontario's Environmental Assessment Act, and Peter and Dilek will speak to that presentation. Peter Brown has worked in the fields of environmental assessment and Indigenous engagement for about 20 years, both as a private sector consultant and as an advisor in the Environmental Assessment and Permissions Division at the MECP. Peter is currently a senior advisor, outreach in the Environmental Assessment Modernization branch at MECP. When not reminiscing about his time as an OAIA board member, Peter enjoys sports, cooking, and the outdoors. And Dilek is with the MECP as well since 2005. During her time with the ministry, Dilek has been involved in several transformational projects undertaken by the EA and Permissions Division, including the modernization of approvals and the modernization of EA programs. Currently, Dilek is a senior project manager with the EA Modernization branch, and in her spare time, she enjoys traveling and attending photography workshops. She's also learning to like sailing, and I am too, so welcome. Yeah, that's great. So I guess I'll pass it over to you then, Terence, and the presentation's up and running, and hopefully we don't have technical issues today like we did yesterday. Good luck. Sorry, you can stand up here.
You want me to stand up?
Yeah, if that works.
Okay.
Or you can sit. I'm okay
No,
with that.
that's
We can be
good,
totally
that's good.
flexible. Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the technical difficulties were yesterday, so if I rediscover them, then it's all going to be a surprise for me, so we'll roll with it. So it's good to see everybody. Thank you. I should be okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, no,
I'm happy if you sit beside me.
It's okay. It's okay. I do have a nice script prepared for me, but I'm not used to being so scripted when I do these things. So I apologize to the team in advance because I see some of them out here in the audience. So if I'm freewheeling and not totally aligned with the messages that were provided to me, we can talk about that later, right? So, but it's been quite a year for the Impact Assessment Agency. And it all started about this time last year with a significant ruling from the Supreme Court of Canada, and we'll talk about that and some of the changes to the legislative framework that have resulted from that. But it's not only that. That was one of the big drivers for kind of a shift in our priorities moving forward. But there was also a significant number of cabinet conversations and discussions, creations of a new ministerial working group or cabinet subcommittee, looking at regulatory reform and issues and how we regulate major projects across the country in recognition of our not just economic agenda, but our climate agenda, in recognizing that we've got ambitious targets established under our emissions reduction plans across the country, and the timelines on those plans are ambitious to say the least. And in order to realize those plans and commitments, a level of infrastructure is going to be required to be developed across the country under timelines we've never been able to develop infrastructure before. And so a recognition and a push that if we're going to be successful in delivering on those plans, we're going to have to do things differently. And that's why these conversations are so important, because being able to bring together bright minds, ideas, innovation is critical to being able to deliver on these expectations and commitments moving forward. So I appreciate everybody coming together to have these conversations. So who is the Impact Assessment Agency? I'll be brief on this. We are kind of a small federal organization reporting to Minister Guilbeault, charged with carrying out impact assessments of, I would say, the largest of the large major projects across the country, those that are most likely to have significant effects in areas of federal jurisdiction, things like major energy, mining, and infrastructure projects. So these projects take place right across the country. We've got offices across the country as well, Vancouver, Edmonton, here in Toronto, Quebec City, Halifax, and St. John's. It's important to have a presence out in the regions and areas where these projects are being developed, and because it comes down to really understanding the issues that are at play, makes a big difference in terms of being able to respond to those public interests that are out there and being able to identify the key issues that need to be assessed and understood. The Impact Assessment Act itself came into force in 2019, so we're just over 5 years into implementing the new Impact Assessment Act. And to say the least, it's been controversial. It's got a lot of attention, a lot of discussions between federal and provincial governments, which led to the Supreme Court ruling last fall. I would say we were disappointed by the ruling in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it wasn't a complete loss. In fact, it clarified a lot of the issues and concerns that have been debated for some time, and the court was very clear that there is a strong role for both levels of government in carrying out environmental assessments of major projects across the country. But what it did dictate was that we need to respect each other's swim lanes better moving forward on these, and we need to work better cooperatively and collaboratively if we're to meet the objectives set out under these frameworks and managing these wicked issues that often come up in the assessments. I think onus is on us to work cooperatively and collaboratively if we're going to be able to address these wicked issues and identify who's best placed to address different issues that come up through these projects moving forward. So the amendments that we brought forward to the Impact Assessment Act were really focused in two key areas. The first area was about better clarifying and defining what are federal effects and federal jurisdiction for the purposes of carrying out impact assessments moving forward. So the court had indicated to us that previous definition was too broad and stretching into areas that were rightfully regulated by provincial government. So we took an effort to redefine throughout the legislative framework kind of what are federal effects for the purposes of impact assessment. And if you look at the legislative framework, it very closely aligns now with kind of the traditional definitions that we had used in environmental assessments. If people remember the old lawless triggers that had formatted and were in place to trigger EAs under previous environmental legislation. The second big change that was moved forward was about decision making and how decisions were taken. And the court took exception that we were taking broad public interest decisions when our mandate was really about managing those effects within areas of federal jurisdiction. So we redefined the decision-making framework under the Impact Assessment Act to be very clear that those key decision-making steps, whether an impact assessment is required, or kind of that final decision at the end of the process is really rooted in, first and foremost, what is the potential for effects in areas of federal jurisdiction, and then if those effects are there, carry out an assessment or determine whether those impacts in areas of federal jurisdiction are justified so that a project can move forward. So it doesn't sound like a whole sweeping change because it's pretty close to how we were applying the Act in practice anyway, but the interpretation of it could have been done in such a way that it could have been seen and encroached significantly in areas of provincial jurisdictions. So the court really put some guardrails in terms of those decision-making processes under the Impact Assessment Act. We made some other ancillary changes at the same time to the Act moving forward, and the most important one is around collaboration, cooperation with provincial governments. We have experience in a cooperation agreement in place with the government of BC that enables us to substitute the provincial assessment process for the federal process. But we weren't able to put in place similar agreements in other jurisdictions across the country. And we had heard that the way the legislation had been crafted before, it was an all or nothing approach. Either the province had to adapt their processes to do everything that the federal government would do in the way in which the federal government would do it, or the provisions wouldn't apply. So we've adopted a much more flexible approach where the legislation will enable us to be able to recognize all the good work the provincial governments are doing and be able to focus in our collaboration and our efforts going forward on what are the gaps and what's remaining, and kind of have those conversations around cooperation about how to fill those gaps on those key issues of federal jurisdiction going forward, whether it's doing it cooperatively with the province, whether it's the province taking some of that on for us, or whether it's the federal government working in parallel to do that. And that's going to vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction as we move forward. So some pretty big fundamental changes there. And so since the legislation came into force in June, we've been having a big push across the country, having conversations with colleagues about how to implement these changes going forward. And we've talked about the goal of one project, one assessment for as long as I've been involved in this space, and it's been more than 15 years, but trying to really put this into life now going forward through new agreements. So we think there's incentives now within the legislative framework to encourage that, and we're having good discussions right across the country to start fleshing this out and how it could work. And like I mentioned, it's going to be different jurisdiction to jurisdiction because every province has different frameworks in place, different ways in which they carry out their assessment processes. And so being flexible federally in how we leverage what provinces are already doing to focus in on how do we want to work together to address those remaining issues moving forward. So we're pushing hard to move this forward. We're not starting from scratch. We've got some really good best practices and examples out there that we're building on. Right here in Ontario, for example, we've had the recent experience of moving forward with the joint review panel on the Marathon Palladium mine, where we had a single team established, working together, supporting a panel process that was completed within a 2-year time frame. Very efficient. And I think maybe the most innovative part of it was just having federal provincial officials sitting together, working together, including on the consultation approach and process, so that as issues were coming up, we're able to stick up our hands on who is the right jurisdiction with the right tools and levers to be able to address these issues moving forward and find a home for them. A lot of these issues even fall outside of the impact assessment process, things like community infrastructure requirements and issues like that coming up, and being able to find programs, tools, and levers to be able to address these issues. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it led to great collaboration with the Bittigang Anishinaabe First Nation, led to their consent for the federal and provincial governments moving forward with that decision through a community referendum, and kind of showing the way that, yes, free, prior, and informed consent can be achieved if we work together to address these issues. So it's a really innovative example I wanted to showcase. At the same time, we're getting really pushed on timelines and efficiencies. As I mentioned, there's a new cabinet committee that's been struck up. It was chaired by Seamus O'Regan, Minister O'Regan. It's now chaired by Minister Hutchings. And their mandate is really to look at the system for major projects, not just the regulatory system, but all of the tools and levers that come into play in ensuring major projects can be developed. So financial tools and levers, Indigenous issues, all those issues that come up, and making sure that we can remove those barriers to development moving forward. One of the big issues, obviously, that comes up, at least in the media a lot, in conversations with industry, is regulatory permitting and timelines. So there was a new cabinet directive put in place in July that has a significant impact on our business moving forward. Includes new timeline commitments. And I would say, maybe if you read the slide, 5 years overall for EA and permitting, 3 years for nuclear. It doesn't sound that ambitious, but when you look at what's really in there, it's not business as usual. It's a groundswell change for us to be able to hit these timelines. It's not a direct comparison to what you hear in some jurisdictions saying they're doing their assessment timelines in 1 year. because the timelines include our planning process. They include the time it takes for proponents to carry out their environmental impact statements and studies, as well as our assessments and decision making. So it's not apples and oranges when we hear these timelines compared to what timeline targets have in place in other jurisdictions, and it's going to require us to retool and rethink how we do assessments, at least federally, to be able to hit these targets, and hopefully with our provincial partners. So it's a big change and a big challenge for our teams that we're working through right now, and it's going to require us, number one, to have those agreements in place with our provincial partners so that we can rely on them to do what they do well, so we can focus in federally on those key issues within federal jurisdictions and manage those issues well. It's not about cutting corners, but it's how do we use the time that we have most efficiently and effectively to address those big risks and issues. And it's how do we use new tools that are available to us, strategic assessments, regional assessments. How do we standardize parts of the process so that we can really focus in on what's unique and different and manage the risks associated with individual projects really well. So that's a big challenge, and I hope you can all think about that and provide us advice in this regard as we move forward. We also have a big effort and focus on consultation. None of that has been lost by the court decision through the legislative amendments. The Impact Assessment Act is one of the first pieces of federal legislation which embeds the commitments to the UN Declaration right in the legislative framework. And we are actively continuing to move forward in that regard. I shared the example about the Marathon Palladium mine and efforts to achieve consent, but we're working across the country with communities on how do we recognize Indigenous jurisdiction, how do communities want to participate in the assessment process, how do we build capacity and support to be able to participate in projects moving forward. Not even just through the assessment process, but new funding programs as well, like the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program that was announced in the federal budget to support Indigenous participation in major projects. These activities and interests and partnerships won't eliminate the issues associated with big projects as they're being developed, but they do create an impetus and a motivation to find innovative solutions and more efficient ways of resolving these issues, and will be key to be able to deliver on some of those other commitments that we were talking about. At the same time, the agency has recently developed an internal reconciliation framework to guide our activities moving forward as well. And so we continue to entrench reconciliation within the culture of our agency and organization moving forward. We still have a lot to learn on this front as well, but we're moving on this journey, and it's a big part of our priorities as an organization and my priorities to continue to push on this, and not just in our external relationships, but in how we carry out our business day in, day out. And I'll leave it there. Probably said too much.
No, that was great. Thank you. That was perfect timing, too. Well done. I'm just going to get you set up on the other one here. I just need to hit this button for you. There you go. Yeah, you're going to adjust that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Brown. Great to see everybody. No technical challenges so far, so that's great. So I'm going to start the presentation, give an overview of some of the things that MECP has been up to with respect to EA modernization in Ontario. Dilek will be up to give some nuts and bolts on the comprehensive EA project regulation. I'll be back to talk about the proposed municipal project assessment process. And then Dilek will be back to wrap up with some upcoming initiatives, and she's available to answer all your tough questions. As most people know, we've been on this journey to modernize our EA program in Ontario, which is about 50 years old and needs some updating. And so really we started with the discussion paper in 2019, EA Act amendments in 2020. And really this has been all about reducing duplication with other processes, making sure that the level of assessment matches the potential impacts of a project. So this is a table, quite a bit of detail. You'll have this presentation after the conference to review. Most of these initiatives, so this is a table of things that have changed, largely because of the amendments to the EA Act in 2020 and because of EA modernization in general. So the amendments to the EA Act enabled a number of changes to EA, and Dilek will talk about some that were recently came into effect. They're very exciting. So I won't go through this in detail right now, but a couple of things that we don't touch on later, and because of the nature of this panel, just wanted to point out cooperation with the federal agency. Now that really the dust is settling on our respective EA, IA Act amendments, we are working together on cooperation when we both have EA requirements for a project. And I know at a project level, we continue to work very closely together. Hey, Kate. Hey. Hi to all the colleagues from the agency that we work with. So I just wanted to point that out. One other thing that we won't touch on later, and hopefully we'll talk about more next year, is moving to online submissions in an electronic EA program. But that's a little bit further in the future. So this is a graphic that sort of shows our journey, starting with that discussion paper in 2019, right? EA Act amendments in 2020. So we consulted on the comprehensive EA projects list, culminating in decision in February 2024. I won't steal Dilek's thunder. And we're continuing to update class EAs, look at new streamlined EA processes, as well as sector-based terms of reference for comprehensive EAs. Now I'll pass it over to Dilek to talk about the comprehensive EA projects list.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for having us today. Great pleasure to share information on our progress made today and some additional information on our near future initiatives. So as Peter briefly mentioned, 2020 EA Act amendments enabled us to move the provincial EA program to a project list approach. Since February 2024, only those projects listed in regulation and those set out in an approved class EA are subject to EA requirements. This is a fundamental change, as previously all projects undertaken by public sector proponents and some designated private sector projects were subject. At this time, we didn't make any changes to the EA process itself. Proponents can volunteer, or they can be made subject for projects which are not listed in regulation or set out in a Class EA, approved Class EA. So in this slide here, we wanted to share with you the projects that required an individual EA before February 2024, and those that will require one going forward. We call the individual EAs comprehensive EAs. Some adjustments in language will always help when you are changing things around. So here I just want to highlight the important changes. So all transportation projects, including provincial freeways, municipal expressways, and railways, as well as all electricity transmission projects, are now subject to the applicable Class EA or streamlined EA process, meaning there are no comprehensive EA requirements for these project types. When it comes to the electricity generation facilities, those which used to trigger individual EA will continue to require a comprehensive EA, meaning there is no change for those ones. So waterfront projects, they used to trigger individual EA because of the proponency or project cost trigger. Now they have to meet a certain criteria for comprehensive EA process. When it comes to landfills, hazardous waste, and thermal treatment projects, we did not make any changes in February 2024. But it worth to mention that we had some EA requirement adjustments or updates to certain advanced recycling projects as well as certain landfill expansion projects back in 2022 and 23, making them subject to streamlined EA processes, applicable ones. So that's the main nuance there. So when it comes to a certain public sector undertakings that used to trigger a comprehensive EA just because they weren't subject to any streamlined EA process, or they were not exempted, specifically exempted from the Act. Those projects are, for example, universities, satellite campuses, war memorials, or municipal projects which hit a certain project cost trigger. They are not subject going forward to comprehensive EA requirements. Why? Because only those that we listed in the regulation, comprehensive EA projects regulation, and those set out in the Class EAs are subject. One of the other amendments that we implemented in February 2024 is related to the expiry date provisions for EA approvals. So the EA Act amendments, which 2020 EA Act amendments also provided for expiry date provisions with an objective to account for potential changes in the environment and or regulatory standards requirements. So since 2024, the February month of February 24, we have a 10-year expiry date on all EA approvals, including those historic ones for the projects which didn't get implemented yet. So Minister has the authority to extend the expiry date for older projects and to include conditions on them as condition of extension. As I mentioned, these provisions came into force in February 2024, and at that time we extended the expiry date for 8 specific projects. Any additional information that you would like to obtain, curious to know about, we have an appendix in this slide deck that you can refer to. It took quite a bit of time, and we had to take a long list of actions to make the move to a project list approach. So those are listed in our appendix. We have the environmental registry posting for all kind of details that you would be interested in knowing about that move. You can also refer to registry posting for expiry date extensions. Next, we will talk about ongoing and upcoming initiatives, and Peter will get us started.
Thanks, Dilek. So yeah, let's talk about the proposed municipal project assessment process. So you may recall in early 2023, the municipal Class EA was amended. Following that, we heard that more could be done to help municipal infrastructure projects get going sooner, like housing projects, for example. And so in March 2023, there was a proposal posted and circulated for a proposed municipal project assessment process. You know, and I should note, like, one of the elements of this proposal was, you know, for these projects to not have EA requirements, so current municipal class EA projects to not have EA requirements at all. And so there were concerns raised about that. And in February 2024, we issued another proposal, the current proposal for a municipal project assessment process. So essentially, the current proposal is for all Schedule C projects under the municipal class EA, the current municipal class EA, with the exception of certain projects, so road projects, private sector projects. But otherwise, all Schedule C projects essentially would be subject to the new municipal project assessment process. You can see on this slide some of the thresholds, et cetera, that we propose, included in that February proposal. You know, I would note that it is an EA process, right? So like other EA processes, it would require consideration of impacts on the environment, mitigation measures, consultation with Indigenous communities and the public, et cetera. It's not changing. Oh, oops. Thank you, sorry. Really the proposed process is modeled after the current TRPAP process, the Transit and Rail Project Assessment Process. Do you call it TRPAP? Does anyone call it Anyway, so if you're familiar with that process, it's similar to what is being proposed for municipal projects. So while, you know, municipal class EAs take up to, say, 2 years now to complete or more, the proposed process, the formal process itself would be time limited, be roughly 6 months. You know, one notable difference is that under the municipal project assessment process, alternatives to the project would not need to be assessed. Alternative methods, yes, would be included in that process, but no alternatives to analysis. You know, similar to the municipal class EA or TRPAP, really roughly 3 consultation points, so no difference there. You know, notice of commencement, consultation during the process, notice of completion, and then similar to MCA or TPAP, review periods, and then an opportunity for minister's orders. So nothing too dissimilar from current processes at the end of the process, but really a number of things to try and limit the time it takes for the overall process. And I'll welcome Dilek up to talk about sector-based tour for landfills.
Thanks, Peter. So as the next phase of the EA modernization work, we initiated projects that will focus on improving the EA process timelines. One of those projects or initiatives is to develop a sector-based terms of reference or a standardized work plan for certain project types. A sector-based or sectoral TOR is envisioned to reduce time it takes to prepare, review, and approve a TOR, terms of reference, the first phase of EA process. Currently, for each project, a TOR is prepared from scratch. We will consult on a proposal that would provide a preset work plan for landfill expansion projects subject to comprehensive EA. We are starting with landfill expansion projects because they require same type of studies. They require consideration of similar or same alternatives and mitigation measures. Another initiative that we initiated recently to improve EA timelines is to update the EA codes of practice. So we will consult on proposed updates to the EA codes of practice, including the codes for preparing and reviewing a tour, preparing and reviewing an EA, and consultation. So updated codes that would be informed by feedback from the public and the indigenous communities will help improve quality of EA submissions and improve the EA process timelines. In closing, we would like to thank you again for the opportunity to present on the recently implemented, ongoing, and upcoming EA modernization initiatives. This is a journey, and we feel like we are on this journey all together. And as we implement our initiatives in phases, we truly appreciate the feedback you have provided to date, and we would like to invite you to continue to provide the feedback on our upcoming initiatives. If you would like to receive direct notifications on our ongoing and upcoming projects, you can send us an email. We have a dedicated email address so that we can include your contact information on our distribution list. I would also suggest that you visit our webpage as well. We have a dedicated webpage on ontario.ca where we post all the updates as they become available. So that webpage includes direct links to the registry where you can use, you can find all kind of information about a proposal or a decision. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for those informative presentations. Very helpful for the audience, I'm sure. So at this time, I welcome people to come up to the microphones in the room there to ask any questions you might have. I know there must be a lot of questions. I'm trying to hold back myself. So.
Okay, we'll arm wrestle. She's bigger, but you're taller than me, so you'll win. I've been doing work in the EA field for 24 years now, but I continue to be perplexed about the okay, we have Canada and Ontario, the federal crown and the provincial crown, but municipalities who are a creature of the province are not a crown. So that is real. I would just like to get some thoughts on that because from a, oh my God, are we not doing this right? Okay, nobody wants to hear me anyway. Okay, thank you. So back to the question, municipalities seem to be in a dead zone or limbo when it comes to duty to consult. And they do issue, from the Supreme Court decision that says when the Crown, so is the municipality a Crown, when the Crown issues a decision, but then municipalities do make decisions, like building codes and stuff like that. So I was just wondering if I could get some clarity on that municipal level. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if I can provide much clarity because I'm not a Supreme Court judge or anything, but as far as we're concerned, we think that municipalities may have a duty to consult in some circumstances. As you mentioned, they are a decision maker in some circumstances, so we think municipalities could have a duty to consult. And certainly when we make a decision and when the province takes an action or makes a decision, and that could potentially impact Aboriginal treaty rights, there is a duty to consult, certainly, and we do delegate that certain procedural aspects of that consultation, including to municipalities. So when we work together, we're responsible for ensuring the duty is fulfilled. When a municipality is making a decision on its own, we think there's a role, certainly for the municipality there, if not a duty. But it is not clear. You're right, it's not clear.
And so basically, you have to delegate it to the municipality for it to be operationalized.
Yeah, where the province makes a decision or takes an action on a project, for example, right. If that project is being undertaken by a municipality, the Supreme Court has said that we can delegate certain aspects of that consultation to the proponent, the municipality.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Really good question.
Mine's kind of related. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. You go then.
Yeah, I think you were next.
It's totally like a follow-up to that. Thank you, Carolyn Coburn O'Donaterra. I was just going to ask, when the EA Act does not apply, who holds that duty, right? Because you can't delegate it down now because it's not within your jurisdiction. So there's this huge gap, and there's this huge potential for impacts on Aboriginal and treaty rights. So that's number one. And number two is, how were Indigenous communities actually consulted about the EA Act changes and these new initiatives that are coming about?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if I can add much more to the first part. So the idea being that, through some of these EA changes, fundamentally, where the projects may no longer require EA, there's not a provincial decision. Municipalities are still required to do some decision making. We would expect them to carry out consultation, right, as being a responsible level of government, responsible to their citizens, et cetera. We see no reason why municipalities couldn't carry out that consultation. Again, not being lawyers or judges, hard for us to comment on whether or not, the duty is applies to municipalities where there is no provincial or federal role. Yeah.
Right, and so, there seems to be a bit of a gap in terms of sharing or that expectation with municipalities potentially then. Okay, so some more work to do.
Yeah, and just maybe further too, obviously we have sister ministries like Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Ministry of Citizenship, Multiculturalism, who we work closely together with on these issues. So, we're responsible for the EA program. Other ministries are responsible for municipalities in general, cultural heritage and archaeology. So, working closely with those folks as well.
Pass it over to this microphone.
Thank you. Thanks for that great presentation. As an EA practitioner for over 20 years, mostly around municipal transportation projects, I've been involved in many projects that have significant impacts, significant engagement, and various levels of complexity, often rightly so, involving the assessment of various alternatives through engagement with the public, technical agencies and other stakeholders, Indigenous and so on. I'm just wondering, what was the thought behind removing roads which have, municipal roads which have a significant potential for impact? How were they removed from what was the thought behind removing those from the future TPAP process or municipal Schedule B and C process, similar to the other ones? And just to add on, I'm concerned about the lack of, by removing that and leaving it up to the individual municipalities, as one gentleman mentioned yesterday in his questions, some of the tier 1 or upper tier municipalities might do a good job. Other ones, the lower ones, some municipalities might not give it the necessary attention and engagement and evaluation of alternatives that they actually need. So what was the level of thought behind pulling the roads out of the B and C and the future TPAP process?
Yeah, great question. We've heard this question, and I mean, I should note that it's still just a proposal, right? So we're still considering feedback on the municipal project assessment process and the project list within it, and so to inform next steps. But in terms of the thinking, so as I mentioned, we amended the municipal class EA in 2023, and then had a proposal which included no EA requirements, right, for municipal projects. We heard that was not a good idea. When it comes to roads in particular, we heard from municipalities included, that they do master planning processes. Like you said, that may not be consistently applied across the board. and that really the class EA, the screening within it, often did not add much value, just added extra time. And so that's why the proposal currently as it stands does not include municipal roads. Yeah. I don't know if there's any, yeah, I think that sums it up. Yeah, thank you. Good question, yeah. Great question.
Dave, we'll pass it over to you.
Yes, thanks Terry, Dilek, and Peter. That was really interesting. It's good to see the province and the federal government together. I think this question is really for the province, but Terry might want to weigh in on it. But I did see you bring up the Marathon PGM project, and I think that was a real oddball one because the province delegated that to the federal process. I think, Ed, you're in the room there. You were on that file, weren't you? It was sort of a harmonization order, so it was kind of a reverse delegation, which was kind of interesting. Are there any new provisions in the Act, Dilek or Peter, to potentially delegate to the federal government, or is it only really the federal government really thinking about making use of provincial processes to deliver the EA requirements? And then you can just answer that one. But the other one too, just I want to get on the distribution list. But will there be any virtual sessions for practitioners just to learn how these things are rolling out? Because I think that would be really helpful, because since February I've been trying to figure out some of these new things that are rolling out. I can read them, but it's also good to have them, so just put that in your back pocket. So I'll just leave that question about the delegation. Thanks.
Okay, for the first one about the harmonization, etc., in 2020, we clarified those provisions in the EA Act to reduce duplication and encourage or facilitate coordination. Ontario Minister can suspend or change requirements of EA Act, or we even have a provision about declaring non-application in part or in full. And we are working with our colleagues at OAIA, Ontario OAIA, to update the current coordination agreement because their legislation has changed, ours is changing, etc., to bring that coordination agreement up to speed. But when it comes to practicality, I believe what is in legislation and what we can do using that legislation will be informed by the project specifics, etc., etc. So I believe we are really careful about updating the coordination agreement in a way that it will provide flexibilities for us. But we are, I believe, committed to making that work a little bit better than it worked until now. About the distribution list, of course, we would like to reach out to as many as individuals, especially experts like you, on these initiatives. And whenever we have a proposal, we schedule webinar sessions. We invite people from federal, provincial government, as well as we schedule webinars with our Indigenous communities. So definitely when you are on the list, you will receive a notification on those virtual webinar sessions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Catherine?
Oh, sorry.
No, that's great.
I could have saved it for later when I come relieve you of your duties over there. But I was wondering, building off of the coordination agreement comment, is there any specificity on timeline around when we might see those agreements? Particularly, we're here with OAIA. Is the Ontario one coming anytime soon?
Unfortunately, I don't have any specifics, but it's something that important to both parties, so we will continue working on it. You will hear from us whenever we are ready to share things.
Okay, thank you.
Please be on the distribution list.
That's a question I ask my team every day as well. So.
There's another question. Oh. There's another question over here. Yeah, you were first. Yeah.
What's your? I'm originally from Fort Albany. I grew up there. I'm resident school survivor. I'm a semi-retired educator, and I've chosen to follow on issues that affect my people. So I must remind everyone that we have a treaty with the government, and the treaty is supposed to last, well, it says as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the water flows. So we must keep in mind with our treaty that it was signed with us to work together. And every time I come, to these kind of meetings, I think it's good to say treaty, but we must remember that it's there forever. I remind that to my young people. Every time I take them down south, I talk to other people there that we meet, and we tell them we have a treaty. We have to share the land, take care of it. There is other things that are impacting our community. Just looking at some of the things that were pointed out here, I already see an impact. Because right now the government is pushing an issue that has to do with our conservation. There's a big impact already with our people, because I know Mushkegwa Council is trying to do their best to work on implementing this package. But you must remember how our people work. We are nation to nation. You come talk to us because it's our land. We know how to take care of our land. We've done it already. So I invite the government, speak to us nation to nation, visit our elders, talk to us face to face. I know our chiefs are there, but we vote the chiefs in. It's the memberships that will, agree to whatever we can benefit from. I know we need to find a benefit that will improve the lives of our young children. There's a lot of homelessness in our community. Our water is bad. There's a community north of where I'm from. They don't have fresh water. So that's still, there. It's not improving. And we want to improve. We want a good life too. Our health system has to improve. We have to fly out for an emergency to see a doctor. That's not right. We're supposed to improve our treaty relationship. And I just want to remind people, we're still here and we're not going anywhere. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, so go
Sorry,
ahead.
and with the gravity of that, thank you for that. I was curious, is there internally, and this is more for Peter and the team at the MECP, provincial MECP, there's been a lot of changes that reflect, obviously, priorities of government, and, how can, it's very difficult for me as an EA practitioner, last 25 years, and someone that studied that, to see processes that are arising that don't really reflect the ecological and social impact and the magnitude of those impacts. It's more related to priorities. But I guess my question is, can there be, or do you see more of a review or strategic review about extreme events, climate change? Is that being built into some of this, or is there a risk assessment that can be built into this modernization? It's just a question if that's unfolding between ministries, and do you see an opportunity for that to be a consideration in some of these modernizations? Because even in the municipal engineering class A's, there's been B's and A's that really was a bit of a paper chasing exercise, but then on the other hand, there's been B's that were, call it a former MEA B project, that's a massive, impact, because it was a transmission line that would result in growth and impact ecologically significant features. I think about the York-Durham sewer system That was a B. That was originally B, that Minister Dombrowski made into a comprehensive EA process, or individually ordered, actually, that to happen. So there are these things. So I was just wondering how much of a lens is being placed on ecological, social impacts as part of this process. Yeah. I'm not the facilitator, that's up to you.
I'm thinking very similarly, sorry about that. So, very similarly, so taking the developers out of proponency is a huge concern, and I know that water engineers and EA practitioners have put that on paper, both from the municipal side as well as consulting. Huge concern there, because it will not capture the impacts at all, even with the other regulations in play. Another major concern that we've had is related to, for example, on the water, wastewater treatment side of things. If you have a percentage limit of capacity expansion, it exempts you from the MPAP. If you have a 300 MLD plant, or million liter per day plant, that 50% is a huge impact compared to a 5 million liter per day or a 500,000 liter per day plant with a 50%. Going back to your question, are you working with practitioners? Do you have a technical working group? Fill us in. We're worried.
Yeah, I mean, so I think more generally, maybe, I think your question was kind of more general. You know, really, we've been working on these project lists, right? Kind of the getting that down. What projects require an EA? I mean, you recall previously every public project required an EA, and then everything was exempt, or most projects were exempt, and it was a mess, right? And so now we're still working on what projects require an EA. So the comprehensive project list is done. Now we're working on these streamlined processes. Yes, absolutely. We have to start turning our minds to, and we have been, we've started to, the bigger questions about climate change and you know, the future of EA, right? We've been sort of working on the project lists and getting those right. Dilek mentioned the codes of practice, how EAs are carried out. Includes, what types of studies are appropriate in 2024. So that's sort of a general. We are moving now towards more how EAs are carried out. What is the future of EA? Going online potentially, and important issues for the future like climate change. Specifically, I think on the technical questions on MPAP. So, like I said, it is a proposal still, right? We've gotten comments like that. If you weren't able to submit those comments, it's not too late. Let us know, what you think, right? And I think to Dave's comment too, we've made lots of changes. We need to be doing outreach and education with the regulated community, with proponents, so that they understand the requirements and the opportunities that EA presents, right, for design to help design projects for the future. And so, it is a proponent-driven process in Ontario. There are benefits to doing EA and doing it well, and so we hope to really highlight some of those and some of the changes that we want to make to our guidance and our code of practice. So, yeah. I think the short answer is yes. We are looking at those things. Yeah.
Just to add, Peter, if I may, currently we expect the proponents to consider cumulative effects, climate change, etc. And on a project-by-project basis, we work with them closely. We have technical experts in-house, so we try to provide the guidance that they may need. Also, we refer them to the existing guidance on cumulative effects. For example, there is a federal guidance, so we refer them to that one. So definitely is in place, but we understand the question and need to focus more attention on it.
We are out of time, but I think I really want to. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that permission. Yeah, no, thank you.
Easy for you to say.
I'll give the provincial team a little bit of a break on this one. So one of the emerging things that is coming up with the Impact Assessment Act is the potential for more Indigenous-led assessments, more Indigenous-led decision-making empowered by Section 114 co-administration agreements. Given the context of the Supreme Court decision, though, how does Canada see itself effectively shielding those decisions that are being made by Indigenous groups in the process within the context of the Act, but may be based on information collected that stem outside of federal jurisdiction? So I'm just wondering, like, how can you empower Indigenous-led assessment and decision-making that is constrained to federal effects, or is that not a risk?
Thank you. It's a complex question, and maybe I should phone some friends here, like my colleagues from Ontario. Hey. But it's an emerging area for us, and we don't have all the answers to this yet. Certainly, the Supreme Court did put some guardrails on what we can and can't do under the Impact Assessment Act, and as we look to develop and advance and support Indigenous-led assessments, we can't share authority that we don't have. But we are working to advance relationships with our provincial partners too, so that we can have and remain to have comprehensive assessments moving forward that can look at the full range of issues jointly and collaboratively. So it is a priority for us, and it does remain a priority, and we are actively advancing a regulatory framework that will enable us to negotiate jurisdiction by jurisdiction cooperation agreements with Indigenous communities across the country. And in the interim, we're using all of the flexibility that we have to advance cooperative lead assessments through the authorities that we already have in place. So we're not going to be starting from scratch. We're going to build on best practices out there. We've got some good case studies. If you haven't seen, I'd point to examples like what we're doing with the Cree in northern Quebec on how things can work as really good examples. And we want to build on that, recognizing that every Indigenous jurisdiction across the country has their own interests and ways in which they want to participate. And we need to be flexible and be able to tailor our approach and processes to those realities.
Okay. Thanks for taking one more question.
You bet.
My question is based on this morning's oral history walk that Gary led, and one of the things that we learned is that the treaty boundary mapping that's being provided to First Nations communities in Ontario is different than the treaty boundary mapping that's available through the province and I think the federal government as well. And my question is pretty foundational as a geographer, a planner, EAIA practitioner. How do we build meaningful relationships and engage in, reconciliation conversations when we don't have the same basic information about whose treaty lands are we on and who should we be talking to?
So I don't know if I have the answer to that question because I wasn't part of the conversation, so I'm not specifically aware of the issue there. I do know that we work federally with our colleagues at Crown Indigenous Relations, and we do, through them, have an Aboriginal Treaty Rights Information System that we try to ensure that's available and accessible so that everybody can have the same information that we utilize to identify who should be involved in assessments moving forward. We share this information with proponents, we share it with communities, we share it with our provincial colleagues so they know how we're identifying communities that need to be involved in our assessments. But I'm not sure I am aware of the specific issue and challenge that you've noted, but Angela, do you have any intel there?
Add, Beth, is to say that part of meaningful consultation is to ask the community that you're working with what's their traditional territory, and that informs the work that we do, right? So hopefully communities themselves are the best guides to us as governments. But I will follow up with you because I know where to find you.
You do know where to find me, and I think Gary wanted to add something.
Well, I don't know if you want to support or not.
I can say when I'm up there on the stage, I have the whole room to myself.
Oh, you're going to talk about it after lunch?
Well, I can. We can do it after lunch.
Okay, let's
They
go
need
after
to
lunch.
a break.
Okay. And now everybody has bated breath for after lunch.
Thank you very much to our guest speakers. Thank you so much for coming today and joining us.
I told you guys that session was going to be good. We'll put up our little Slido. You guys can work on it on the break. We did go overtime, so everybody just get back by 11:05, and we'll get started again. Thanks all for your excitement. Welcome to session 6. Session 6 is brought to you by our silver sponsorship. Oh. Good? Okay. Is brought to you by our silver sponsors, Minogue, Dylan Consulting, GHD, and Williams & Shire. So thank you all so much for your continued support with OAIA. I'm happy to introduce you all to a member of my team, another Catherine. We're going to really confuse you. Catherine Bibby, Catherine with a K, I'm with a C. And Catherine's going to moderate this session for us. So buckle up. Here we go. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Catherine. There's a lot of duplicate names in our team, so it's just something that we have. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to just ask all the speakers for session 6 to come on up and join me at the table. Mina, Rob, Claire, and Kendra. And while they're coming up, I just wanted to say welcome to session 6. So session 6 is about process modernization. So we've got a few different examples and approaches and perspectives on that subject. And so we're going to go over each of those topics. And I'm just going to do a little introduction for each of them before we get started. I'll start with Mina, who's going to be our first presenter, and then I'll do the introductions for the others as they come up to the table. All right, so Mina Patel is a lead social scientist with WSP. She has more than 16 years experience working on projects primarily related to Indigenous engagement and assessing the social and economic impacts of development on Indigenous peoples through her project work. I'm very happy to welcome her up to the podium to the first presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. Catherine and Catherine are my colleagues at WSP. First of all, I want to say thank you for the OAIA for accepting my abstract. And might change my mind in 20 minutes, but I'm not too sure. But thank you. It's an honor to be here today. And I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about myself. A really good friend of mine who is an Indigenous scholar from northern Saskatchewan, she was a big proponent of we as technicians and scholars, we should disclose a bit about our background because we all come into our work with a perspective. And as much as we like to say we're very objective, we still bring our perspective into our work. So to just mention a bit about yourself. So for myself, as Catherine said, I'm a lead social scientist with WSP. I've been a consultant for just over 10 years. Prior to that, I used to work for Indigenous-led organizations directly. I worked for Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta. And I'm really grateful that my career started with Indigenous organizations because I feel it's given me a perspective which is extremely valuable, and I carry it with me every day. For myself, I was born and raised in the UK. My family came from India and moved over to the United Kingdom in the 1950s and 1960s. So that's the perspective I bring to my work. So my presentation today is called A Space for Indigenous-Led Impact Assessments. So it's about, this topic came about because of some of the challenges I saw working in this space over the last 10, 11 years. The task of integrating an ILIA or Indigenous knowledge into the EA process faces a fundamental challenge in that it raises the expectation that Indigenous participation or Indigenous knowledge must be deemed acceptable by a non-Indigenous run government agency. And so that's the big flaw in the system. So, I've got this thing. So I wanted to be a bit cliche and start my presentation with a quote. And this is a quote by Dr. Taiyaki Alfred, who is a Mohawk philosopher. And this is something that he wrote in a paper that he submitted on behalf of the Impact Assessment Agency in 2021. So he says, "There's a failure thus far to break the structural problem that consists in the fact that the entire impact assessment system up until now has been oriented to supporting proponents." Now, saying that the whole EA process supports proponents, this is not really new information. But framing the issue in a systemic lens, I think, is quite eye-opening. If the EA process was more holistic, then government and proponents would understand that for an EA to be effective, then the process should begin and end by placing the lives of the people most affected by the projects at the center of the process, and that is the local people, whether they're Indigenous or not. They're the ones who are most impacted, yet in our current system, at least from my perspective, local people, are often given less consideration than species, plant species, animal species. As technicians, we kind of go to town on that stuff. So Sarah Bice, an Australian academic, she says, she works a lot in this space in Australia, and she says that in the EA process, where community perspectives are poorly understood, attempts to address social impacts and deliver local benefits frequently fail. So when I put my abstract together for this conference, I decided to focus on these two questions. Is there a way of developing a space for ILIAs in the EA process that does not compromise or minimize Indigenous participation? And how can IA practitioners, or EA practitioners such as myself, who traditionally work on behalf of proponents, assist Indigenous communities in this process? Sorry, I had to print out my notes because I just finished working on them last night. So anyway, after my abstract was accepted, I can tell you I immediately regretted posing these two questions because I thought, what was I thinking? And also, how can I answer these two questions? But then I also realized, well, I can't answer these two questions. And that's not really why I'm here. I'm here to foster dialogue and maybe develop some ideas. And of course, I accept that this is already happening because we saw it a lot yesterday in the presentations. These are things that came up time and again. So, it is something that's already happening. But I also thought there's another way of looking at these questions. So for instance, if I reframe the first question, I think the focus could be what supports do Indigenous communities need to ensure ILIAs are not minimized? And as for the second question, well, I'm kind of hoping that we'll get some feedback from people here today, especially some technicians. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my experience. So when I started working in this space, it was back in 2013, and I was hired by a consulting firm in Calgary who most of their work was assessing pipelines. And these were all mostly federal EAs. So I was hired to lead the socioeconomic VCs, but from to use an Indigenous lens on them. So for instance, if I looked at something like employment and economy as a VC, we saw that some of the communities along the pipeline route of the project we were assessing still had some reliance on traditional economy. So then we integrated that into the EA. For social and cultural well-being as a VC, we didn't want to just look at the impacts of a work camp. Getting ahead of myself. Sorry, but we didn't want to look at just the impacts of a work camp. We wanted to also consider something like, well, if there's less berry patches, for instance, what would the cultural impact be on those communities? So, transference of knowledge. So we had all these weighty considerations. But unfortunately, along the way, we did receive a lot of pushback, not just from our client, but also from within our own company. And the prevailing attitude at the time was very much, well, all these years, we're getting project approval, so why are you guys trying to change things? And by the way, just a coda to that, the proponent that we worked with on that project, I recently just completed a project with them 10 years later, and they're pretty on board with a lot of this stuff now. So a lot has changed in the last 10 years. So this wasn't an Indigenous-led impact assessment that I'm talking about, but I'm just trying to give an example of what we as technicians can do. We can be pushing some boundaries. We were working under the NEB guidelines in that particular project I'm talking about, and they are guidelines. There is room for some expansion. So also in that particular example, what we had proposed is something that we had called a weighted issues report. And the intention there was that we wanted to survey the Indigenous communities potentially impacted and ask them the questions, can you please list what your major challenges are, not just project specific, but cumulatively and just overall challenges, because the idea is that we really wanted to understand where the communities were coming from. And we wanted them to tell us, what are your major challenges? Never mind just project impacts. And we wanted this to make our EA more robust. We wanted to make the mitigation more relevant. And we also wanted to give the proponents some information that could also assist in things like impact benefit agreement negotiations. So unfortunately, that report we never actually got to do because this was during the downturn in the economy. So we literally went from please spend a lot of money doing this to please don't spend anything at all. So yeah, it was a bit of a shame, but we had some great ideas. So what is an Indigenous-led impact assessment? Well, there is no one definition, but there's some common factors. That I've seen anyway. Significant degree of control of the entire process by Indigenous peoples, methodology and content determined by Indigenous peoples, and the process legitimized by the Indigenous community. And the most important factor is that Indigenous communities determine for themselves what factors to include in the ILIA rather than having someone else decide it for them, and not be constrained by proponents and by regulators. I did read one definition that I quite liked, and It said a community-based impact assessment is one that is conceived from the perspective of the community, and I think that kind of sums it up, and we don't really need to go beyond that because it isn't really something we need to define. It's something that the Indigenous communities need to determine for themselves. But if we go back to the quote by Dr. Alfred, we can see that ILIAs hopefully can address a power imbalance that exists in the current process, increase self-determination, foster more meaningful engagement. So yeah, that's some of the, hopefully the intentions behind them. So when I talk about space, what exactly do I mean? So the way I see it is that the current space is very much dominated by proponents in government, and the space is focused on how proponents can receive approval for their projects. But if all the space is taken up by those two parties, then what's left for Indigenous communities and what's left for an Indigenous-led impact assessment? Because they're not necessarily trying to get approval for a project, they're trying to draw attention on the actual impacts to their communities. And also when I talk about space, it kind of comes from the concept of third space, which I won't get into too much, but it's in this sense, it's that one space is occupied by proponents in government, and another space is occupied by Indigenous communities, and a third space is hopefully where they can come together. Oops. Sorry, I had to shorten my presentation a bit because it was getting too long. So I did want to go into more detail about some of the regulatory processes, but I felt it was going to make my presentation a little bit too long, but I'll talk about it on a very high level. So some of the challenges in the current EA process. Opportunities for Indigenous peoples to voice their views is controlled by regulators and proponents currently. Even if regulators listen to Indigenous voices, they may not always take action on what they hear. Indigenous peoples are not involved in developing EA methodology, or they're not involved in project approval either. So I wanted to touch on a couple of examples, and I've got more than two, but I'm only going to focus on two because, as I said, my presentation was starting to get a bit too long. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Secwepemc Nation, and I'm just going to say SSN from here on because I did look up how to pronounce the name, and I know that I've been butchering it, so I don't want to continue doing it that way, so don't want to offend the community. But so I'm going to say SSN and the Ajax mine. So back in 2011, Ajax Mine applied for an EA approval for an open pit copper and gold mine and iron ore processing facility in the traditional territory of the SSN. And this is a project that required both federal and provincial approval. So for SSN, previously having negative experiences in the EA process, they promoted an alternative approach. They designed their own assessment process, which was consistent with their laws, traditions, and customs. The SSN also had the option to participate in the Crown's assessment process and to engage in government-to-government consultation regarding the mine. And out of this came a government-to-government framework agreement. This agreement established a procedural framework for how the Crown EA and the SSN EA would work in parallel and collaboratively. Now, of course, this was a long process. There's a lot of details, and I'm not going to go into this today, but what I can tell you is that in March 2017, the SSN Council issued their decision on the Ajax mine, and they decided they did not consent to the project. And I use the word consent because that's based on SSN using free, prior, and informed consent. In December 2017, BC refused to grant an EA certificate to Ajax Mine on the basis that the BC minister concluded that Ajax would result in significant adverse effects to Indigenous heritage and to the current use of lands and resources for traditional purposes. The minister further concluded that the proposed mitigation measures and conditions were not sufficient to minimize the adverse effects, and thus decided to not issue an EA certificate for the Ajax mine project. So my second example is the Squamish Nation and wood fiber LNG. This, back in 2015, it was the first legally binding Indigenous-led impact assessment of a project in Canada. So the agreement included things like regulatory discussions at the working group level and committee level, economic benefits, no expansion of the wood fiber operations without the nation's consent, co-manage environmental plans, business and employment opportunities, and inclusion of the Squamish Nation in monitoring activities at the project site. The outcome of the nation's ILIA has led to improvements in wood fiber's project plans, and the nation has created an environmental working group for both wood fiber and Fortis projects. Squamish Nation came up with their own assessment process as well. And what the nation said is that the federal and provincial government rely heavily, if not entirely, on the EA process to fulfill their duty to consult. And this is a problem, obviously, because the EA process works within a defined set of parameters and that are set by regulators. So some things the Squamish Nation took issue with in the current EA process were project siting, often done without Indigenous input, spatial scale of EA, often not relevant to Indigenous nations. In other words, it would be project specific. Cultural values were narrowly defined. Indigenous rights and titles, also narrowly defined and oversimplified. Poor information collection, and tight deadlines for EA, often not allowing for Indigenous nations to comment on information gathered by proponents. Sometimes this information was also presented in a way that was overly technical and difficult to understand, and then of course no shared decision-making, decisions made by government. For the Squamish Nation to give consent to a project on their territory, they have two criteria. The first one is the nation must make an informed decision, and the second, it should be a shared decision-making process with the Crown. So a few things stood out to me in these two examples. Both nations considered the information provided by proponents and SMEs, so just as we would as technicians for carrying out an EA. So giving weight to these studies. The nation considered the outcome of traditional knowledge studies rather than relying on government and proponents to interpret the information. And their process, and this is the one that really stood out for me, the process in both cases paralleled, to the extent possible, the Crown's EA process. And they did this to provide certainty to proponents and to the Crown. So there was consideration. It wasn't just ignoring the Crown's process. And finally, they also recognize that this is an evolving process, so their frameworks can change. So some common factors for success that I have seen along the way is a lot of effort was put into developing good partnerships before any agreements were signed. And they were equal partnerships. They were government-to-government relationships. So, sorry, okay. Sorry, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. So how can we, as EA practitioners, who traditionally work on behalf of proponents, assist Indigenous communities in this process? So things like be open to learning and understand that Indigenous knowledge is not just as, if not more, relevant as Western science in the EA process. I remember early on in my career going up to a community in northern BC and talking to a hereditary chief who said, you know, our knowledge is also scientific. We know where the fault lines are. And we see surveyors coming out and they don't know this information, but they don't ask us. You know, they think we are whimsically running through the forest with our bow and arrow hunting moose, and that's just how they treat us. So, you know, it's giving more credence to that knowledge. And the other thing is, from my research, sorry, it's the last one. I see that there's two steps to success for the EA process, both in the traditional EA and for ILIAs, and that's a systemic shift. So something as simple as baseline profiles that are more robust. I've seen significant assessments where, the baseline for a community is only 2 or 3 paragraphs. When I came along, I started to do more extensive baseline, and people thought it was a bit crazy, but all of that was being used in the assessment. It was all being assessed. So understanding those communities better, having more robust baselines, asking the community to give us that information, or at the very, very least, verifying the information. We can't just rely on Stats Canada. And there needs to be a philosophical shift in perspective. So more than just saying, please do an ILIA and thank you, we'll now use that information in whatever way we choose, we need to give it more relevance. So, yeah, okay, sorry, that's my last slide. So thank you. I think I've run out of time, but thank you for everything.
Thank you, Mina. I really appreciated your sort of reflections and lessons learned, and I think that's going to be helpful to a lot of people in the room. So we're going to move to our next presentation, and this presentation will be presented by Robert Young with Hatch, and the presentation will be on lithium hydroxide conversion plant in Quebec as a case study. Rob leads Hatch's ISO 14001 certified environmental management system that focuses on sustainability in Hatch's operations. He has over 30 years experience serving resource, construction, and public sector clients, and works on a whole range of work, including environmental impact assessment, due diligence, compliance auditing, and environmental planning and management and permitting. So I will pull up your slide deck here, Rob. Here it is. There it is, found it. Okay. That's up there now. Thanks, Rob.
All right. Okay, drop that there. Thank you, Catherine. And I'm pleased to be here this morning to talk to you about a case study and talk about the Nemaska Lithium's lithium hydroxide conversion plant. In this case, I want to present the issues-based approach that we followed, and also talk a little bit about the voluntary nature of the exercise. To provide really some context to the project, as you know, as in Ontario and in Quebec are pushing very strongly to convert our economies and transportation to EV supported systems. Quebec has really made a mandate of doing it as part of their climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation program. And of course, they obviously want to leverage their abundant resources in hydropower to power that industry. The proponent is Nemaska Lithium, and Nemaska Lithium is an integrated company. They have a mine site that's currently being permitted in Wabouchi, Quebec, to supply the lithium, and they have the lithium hydroxide conversion plant that is currently under construction in Bécancour, Quebec. And Bécancour it's an industrial park located roughly halfway between Montreal and Quebec City. So with the new EV battery industry coming into the province, and there was a number of positive perspectives as well as challenges, and the challenges are somewhat common to most industries. The perspective was that it's going to support the decarbonization of the economy and transportation. In the case of Nemaska, it's providing 1,500 direct jobs, and it's also supporting regional growth and prosperity. Because the current industrial park is kind of stagnated. The economy's been fairly slow, and this is really a kickstart to the economy to get the process moving again. Some of the challenges are, like I mentioned, are common to many other projects. There's a lack of finite mineral resources. You're using land to develop the industrial parks, and in this case, the site, while it was within the bounds of industrial park, it was still a greenfield site before it was developed. there will be a large influx of employees and workers coming into the site, some permanent, some temporary, and that of course places strain on housing, healthcare systems, and family support systems. So that was one of the key focuses of the ISHA we conducted. Now, Nemaska wanted to use the ISHA as a tool to help de-risk the project. They did it voluntarily because under the Quebec legislation, their production capacity was not at the limit that required a full provincial ISHA. But they recognized there were a number of benefits for carrying out the ISHA. One of them being gaining social acceptance for the project. They wanted to be also fully transparent with the environmental impacts resulting from it and the mitigation measures that they would be employing. They thought it would also help provide smoother integration into the region. And they also wanted to use it to reflect the just transformation and how, as part of Quebec's overall just transition, they were balancing and identifying biophysical and human environment factors that needed to be addressed during the ISHA. Some of the positive benefits coming out of doing the voluntary ISHA: it gave them a vehicle to engage with local communities. It provided them with the technical information and impact information that they could go out to the communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to talk about the project and get some feedback. They want to understand better the needs and the rights of the Wabanaki Nation, which is the First Nations closest to the project site. They want to also look at it in a regional context, because while the site is fairly small, the impacts from having 1,500 people in the site, having trucks going in and out of the site, that sort of thing was more of a regional context. So they want to look at a broader impact on the region around Bécancour, not just the town itself. It also was provided a great opportunity to identify the mitigation measures needed early in the process. So between conceptual design and detailed design, the designers were provided with the commitments and the outcomes of the ISHA so they could work those into the design of the project and its ultimate construction and execution. The team that we implemented, we were an integrated team with our client, Nemaska Lithium. Hatch was the ISHA management lead and delivery lead for the program, and we were supported in the consultation by Transfer Environmental, who supported the consultation with both the Indigenous communities and the local non-Indigenous communities. So factors that to consider with the issues-based approach. It is the approach that's preferred right now in the province of Quebec and has been for the last few years. But Nemaska felt that the creation of the new industry, it was essential that we looked at a big picture in terms of impacts, both environmental and on human-based impacts. Again, to support the just transition or just transformation that the province is looking for. The issues-based approach we thought was also more integrative. We were able to look at a broader base of issues and concerns and a broader base of valued environmental components, and there were a lot of them. So it covered a lot of territory that would not have necessarily been covered elsewhere. And the other important component of it is we did produce a number of accessible ISHA summary reports that could be used through the consultation program, of more plain language reports that were easier to digest. So in total, we identified through workshops with the proponent, with stakeholders, both internal and external to the proponent, identified 9 issues that were key to the success of the ISHA. Those included management of process waste, traffic, both road and rail traffic, climate change, socioeconomic expectations, quality of life, public health and safety, protection of wetlands, water bodies, and surface water, biodiversity overall, and the rights of the Wabanaki Nation. And out of that 9 issues, we identified 16 valued environmental components to work with, including circular economy, noise and air quality, soil, groundwater, surface water quality, quality of life, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, land use, landscape or visual impact assessments, regional economy, standard of living, wildlife and flora that was culturally important, but also general aquatic and terrestrial wildlife as well. So just some examples on the screen here of how we tied different VECs to different issues. And what the process kind of showed is there were a number of VECs that were applied, that could apply to just about every single issue. And we found that quality of life, and this again coming through both the stakeholder engagements, but for early in the project and later, quality of life was one of the primary concerns. So that's why it's identified both as an issue, but also as a VEC, and across most of the issues. There's some basis of evaluation, but typically, you know, the management process waste, for example, dealing with air quality and noise and truck transportation, those impacts on quality of life. And then quality of life related to biophysical components with wetlands, watercourses, groundwater. So they're all connected in that way. And, you know, as I mentioned here, some of the challenges, many VECs applied to more than just one issue. So but we had to apply them differently as we went through the process. Initially, I think we did have some challenges differentiating between what's an issue and what's a VEC, and trying to make that narrative make sense. And it took a while. And we talked about flexibility yesterday, and in this presentation, I want to talk about flexibility too, in a way that we got to a point where it's like, it's okay. It was okay to have just an issue and a VEC being the same, because at the end of the day, they will be evaluated, and there will be mitigation measures coming out of that. So it would have been addressed. And then we'll use professional judgment to carry out those investigations and to do the evaluations and try to tease out what the important factors were. A couple of examples, just taking the issues to the positive outcomes. One issue that is raised was the management of the process waste, and what are we going to do with it? How is it going to happen? How's it going to be managed? The VEC in this case we're focusing on for this example was a circular economy. So early on, the project proponents in Nemaska Lithium identified that the aluminum silicate and sodium sulfate coming out of this plant can be used for feedstock for other industries. So in the interim, they'll temporarily landfill the material at a secure landfill site in dedicated cells where it can be extracted again. But at the same time, they're also working with a number of R&D organizations and talking to other developers about how they can implement and use these raw materials or these waste products as raw materials in their process. So the advantage is to try to encourage a circular economy, reduce the impact reduce the use of raw materials, and really kind of grow the business in Bécancour. So the perspective is that perhaps the other industries will set up in Bécancour and it'll help grow that community or grow that industrial park and grow the economy locally even larger than it is. Another aspect was socioeconomic expectations, and this is tied again to the regional economy. And a couple of factors here, but a lot of them dealing with, would they have enough employees in the area to support this industry, this project, as well as carry-on projects. And the way they looked at it is that they want to they're working with local educational institutions to develop programs to help support the EV industry. They're also working with the communities to identify different needs in terms of what the educational experiences are going to be. And the goal is to really reduce the burden on the local industry, the local population, be able to have people trained that can stay put, not have to go out west, not have to go out east, just stay home and work on the projects, and also develop the next generation of employees. And the other issue of concern with the community was that, hey, this big project, these big industries are going to take our smaller and medium-sized companies' employees away. they wanted to make sure that they mitigated that by developing in the long term an employment pool that would be dedicated to EV industries, so other businesses would not suffer from labor shortages. Indigenous engagement was one of the key factors as well, because the project's located on the ancestral lands of the Wabanaki Nation and the Dikan. I knew I was going to get out. Dikina. It was acknowledged early on that they were important. The issues are complex, and they wanted to have the Wabanaki Nation involved in the EA, and they were involved in a number of ways. They were responsible for the archaeological studies on site. They looked after the small game surveys that we conducted on the site. They also contributed and wrote the impact assessment dealing with the Wabanaki Nation in the Isha. They provided all the background information for the existing conditions for the socioeconomic section, and they also contributed to cumulative effects. So we weren't just looking at cumulative effects from our standard perspective. They were engaged in identifying those and identifying different ways of looking at cumulative effects. So it was very, very positive working experience. And I think we got a lot out of that. Like I said, we had their technical teams participating in the environmental assessment. Also, they're planting as part of the site landscape plan, because they were impacting black ash, sweetgrass, and small game. One of the aspects is that they're planting black ash as part of the landscaping plan, and that will be accessible for the use. They're also have an Indigenous employment strategy in effect, so they're looking at staffing from the Wabanaki Nation, and as well providing education to other employees about the importance of the Wabanaki Nation and issues and the concerns of facing them. So everyone would understand that issue. Way ahead. So in conclusion, some of the conclusions coming out of this exercise, we found that the voluntary ISHA really allowed us to address a broader base of issues and concerns. Remember that this project did not have to do an ISHA, so they would have went straight to permitting, which really only addresses biophysical considerations, and the human environment would have been left out of the equation entirely. So this project and this approach, we were able to really emphasize the issues related to the human environment. It was really helpful to de-risk the project and also help with the consultation exercises, because we had documentation that we could produce and work through with everyone. It was a process that went ongoing. The issue was developed in draft, obviously consulted on, feedback being, and then repeated those cycles until everybody was happy with the outcomes and the way it was produced. It also helped us focus the effects on some of the key issues that were affecting the community, so that we were answering their questions about truck traffic, about employment, about socioeconomic and biophysical impacts. So we were able to really drill down on those in a detailed way. A couple of lessons learned, and we had 9 issues. That was a lot to work with. I don't know. There could have been a couple, we could have combined some to make it a bit more efficient, but at the same time, we wanted to respect the process, wanted to respect what the stakeholders had said at the beginning, said that these are the 9 issues, and it was reconfirmed as the processes went through, the consultation went through the various phases. So 9 was the right number. It was a lot, but we worked with it. Also differentiating or understanding the difference between an issue and a VEC, although there doesn't necessarily have to be one, like I said. I think the EA folks on the team, like myself, I think we jumped ahead, started getting into this because we were kind of excited about the process without setting the ground rules first. So when we workshopped it with our SMEs, we did have to take that step back and figure out what we're doing and then go ahead. But at the end of the day, I think it worked out to be a really worthwhile exercise, and it was a really different way of looking at an EA. So, and I want to thank everyone for listening, and we also, if you're interested, the link is, I've got the link in the presentation, Consultations in Nemaska Lithium. It has the full ESHA, the summary reports, and all the technical supporting studies there to take a look at.
Thank you very much, Rob. I appreciated the definition of ESIA, because I was thinking ESIA and you said ESHA. So now I know a new term. But that's an interesting example given, car batteries are a resource that is in higher demand, and seeing how that's been implemented in Quebec. So thank you for sharing that. We are going to change from battery project to nuclear projects. I'm just going to hit present here, and I'll introduce our speakers. So we have from the Canadian Nuclear Commission, two people who are going to present. We've got Claire O'Neill-Sanger and Kendra Warnock-Juteau. And so Claire is an acting panel management analysis with the Review Panel Division at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and works on nuclear project files. She's got a multidisciplinary background with a Master of Science in Environmental Studies and Climate Change from Concordia University, and we've also got Kendra Warnock-Juteau, and she's an environmental review officer with the Environmental Review Division of the Canadian Nuclear Safety group. So her group within that organization supports the CNSC's mission and mandate by providing the regulatory leadership and expertise for the conduct of environmental reviews and assessments. So welcome. Please come up and share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Good morning. So my name is Kendra. I'm with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and I am joined today by my counterpart, Claire, from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. So today we're going to be delivering a joint IAC-CNSC presentation on integrated assessments for designated nuclear projects. And specifically, we're going to be looking at efficiencies within the process. So our topic today is actually quite relevant and timely when considering the current landscape of existing and anticipated nuclear projects in Canada. I think over the last day and a half as well, we've heard a lot of mention of nuclear projects. So currently there's actually only one proposed new nuclear project that's in the planning phase of an integrated assessment, and that would be the proposed Bruce C nuclear project in Kincardine, Ontario. But we are anticipating a handful of other nuclear projects to enter into the process in the next little while, including some projects in Ontario. So this is our outline for today's presentation, but for the sake of time, we're just going to get started and jump right in. So staff at IAC and the CNSC have actually been working together pretty closely over the last few years as we prepare for the integrated assessment process. So to start off today's presentation, we're just going to talk a little bit about federal oversight for designated nuclear projects. So I think we kind of all know by now, but the Impact Assessment Act, the IAA for short, was put into force in August of 2019, and under that act, IAC is the federal department that is responsible for conducting impact assessments. So under the act, impact assessments are responsible and used to assess both positive and negative impacts of environmental, economic, health, and social effects of proposed projects, as well as impacts to Indigenous nations and communities, and impacts to treaty rights. So the IAA itself lays out the impact assessment process and the legislated timelines that both IAC and proponents must abide by. It also identifies factors that must be taken into consideration during the impact assessment process as a whole, as well as during decision making. So I think we've discussed this as well a little bit over the last few days, but it is important to note that the IAA supports cooperation and coordination with other jurisdictions. So that does include Indigenous governments, provinces, as well as life cycle regulators such as the CNSC. And in the case of nuclear projects, the IAA outlines the obligations to refer designated nuclear projects to integrated assessments while working collaboratively between IAC and the CNSC. So the types of activities that are regulated and subject to the IAA are outlined in the physical activities regulations. We'll typically informally call that the project list. And we consider the activities listed on the project list as designated projects. So designated nuclear projects are nuclear activities which meet the thresholds that are outlined in the project list, and we have included them here on the slide in case you're curious. So basically, all designated nuclear activities that are regulated under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, or the NSCA for short, are regulated by the CNSC and must undergo an impact assessment by both IAC and the CNSC in what we call the integrated assessment process. So the process is really aimed to reduce duplication in requirements, as well as to meet the objectives of one project, one assessment. So a little bit of a side note before we continue. The CNSC does have a review process for proposed nuclear projects that do not trigger an integrated assessment under the IAA. So for projects like that, they would be subject to an environmental protection review under the NSCA, which is an assessment that's led by CNSC staff and is one facet of the overall licensing technical assessment. But for this specific presentation, we're really just focusing on the integrated assessment process for designated projects. So the CNSC and IAC actually signed a memorandum of understanding back in October of 2019. And the MOU confirms the commitment to work collaboratively in conducting integrated assessments for nuclear projects under the IAA. And I would say like the main goal of the MOU is really just to ensure that reviews are conducted in an effective and an efficient manner without duplication of effort or without unnecessary delays. So the MOU does provide guidelines for the implementation of the integrated assessment process, and we have kind of listed the main objectives here on the slide, but in case you're interested and want to learn more, the full MOU is also available on both IAC and the CNSC's websites. At a high level in the integrated process, IAC is responsible for assessing the environmental, health, social, and economic effects of proposed projects, while focusing on preventing adverse effects and fostering sustainability. The CNSC is responsible for the life cycle regulation of nuclear facilities and nuclear activities, and our goal is to protect human health, safety, and security, as well as the environment. So to conclude this slide, the MOU just basically ensures that integrated assessments benefit from the expertise of both CNSC staff and staff at IAC. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the integrated assessment process itself. So when a project includes activities that are regulated under the NSCA, the minister must refer the impact assessment to an integrated review panel. So referral to an integrated assessment by review panel means that there's one single process for both the impact assessment as well as for the initial licensing process and the initial licensing decision, rather than having one IAC-led process and one separate CNSC-led process. So through this integrated process, the requirements of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act are actually implemented and integrated into the impact assessment process. So the integrated assessment process under the IAA, it assesses the potential effects over the life cycle of the project, and it does automatically consider the first licensing phase for the nuclear facility, which is site preparation. At the end of the integrated assessment process, an impact assessment decision is going to be made as to whether the project can proceed or not, and if it can, under which conditions. And if that impact assessment decision is positive, then a decision would then be made on the licensing for the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. So this slide here provides just a little bit more information on the CNSC's regulatory oversight, as well as a little bit of information on our licensing process. So I did mention on the last slide that the integrated process considers always at a minimum at least the initial licensing phase for a nuclear facility, which is site preparation. But that being said, proponents can actually choose to apply for multiple licenses within the integrated assessment process. So for example, a proponent could choose to apply for both a site preparation license and a license to construct within the integrated process. So regardless of which phases are applied for within the integrated process, the proponent actually must come back to the CNSC for all subsequent licensing decisions, and they have to provide us with the required information in order to proceed to said decision. So basically, a decision is made under the NSCA for every licensing phase throughout the whole life cycle of a nuclear facility. We also do that for any major license amendment requests or license extension requests. And throughout that, the CNSC performs our ongoing compliance and monitoring activities to ensure that all license conditions are being met by the proponent and the licensees. So I will now pass the presentation over to Claire.
Thanks, Kendra. So as Kendra mentioned, all designated nuclear projects must be referred to an integrated assessment by review panel. And I have the pleasure of working for the review panel division at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. So review panels are groups of independent experts, the members of which are not public servants like myself. They're often academics, consultants, or recognized experts in a specific field. So it's similar to the CNSC's commission, where the panel operates outside of the government's influence. So once appointed, the panel is responsible for conducting the impact assessment, which includes collecting information, holding public hearings, as well as preparing the impact assessment report. So once the panel is appointed, IAC and the CNSC in that process will act like any other participant, with all communications between it and the panel done in an open and transparent manner on the registry. So for integrated assessments of nuclear projects, at least one member of the review panel is put forward by the CNSC, but the majority of the members cannot be from the CNSC roster. So the public hearing is a very key component of the integrated review panel process, as it provides an opportunity for participants to share their views directly with the review panel, as well as to ask other questions to participants. So following the public hearing, the review panel will prepare the impact assessment report, which outlines its recommendations under the Impact Assessment Act to the Governor and Council. And if the project is approved, the panel then acts as the commission and will make the initial licensing decisions under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. I get shaky when I'm nervous, so I apologize. So here is a diagram of the federal integrated assessment process. It's probably familiar to many of you in the room. Just like any other federal impact assessment led by the agency, the integrated assessment process is divided into 5 official phases, so from the planning phase to the post-decision phase. Of course, here, for an integrated assessment for nuclear projects, the assessment phase is led by the review panel. And for our purposes, we've also added the pre-planning phase. And Faiza, I thought of you yesterday. I was like, oh, I hope she likes this, because we always include it now to acknowledge all the work that we're doing with proponents, with Indigenous communities, with the public, before an initial project description is even submitted, to build those relationships and prepare folks for the process. So CNSC is involved throughout the integrated assessment process by providing their technical expert advice. And then once the Governor and Council issues the decision, and should the project be allowed to proceed, the CNSC is the life cycle regulator and would then issue a license and take over the responsibilities of consultation, enforcement, and compliance activities. So on average, the impact assessment process by a review panel takes approximately 4.5 years end to end, so meaning from the start of the planning phase through to decision making. And Terry kind of stole my thunder on this, but you're probably all aware by now anyways that Budget 2024 announced measures to help clarify and reduce timelines for major projects, and specifically for nuclear sector projects, the Government of Canada has now set a 3-year target for project reviews. So in order to support a 3-year target timeline, there are 3 criteria that we recommend proponents meeting before they submit their initial project descriptions. So these are meaningful Indigenous engagement, the identification and early resolution of issues, as well as the preparation and of timely quality submissions with the required information and studies. I'll dive more into these efforts that we've been making to increase efficiency of assessments of nuclear projects, as well as our expectations for proponents. First, going to go over opportunities for Indigenous participation in the integrated assessment process. So regardless of timelines, a key aspect of the integrated assessment process is to ensure the consultation with Indigenous nations and communities. So IAC seeks to work with Indigenous people in a way that advances reconciliation, respects the rights and culture, and ensures consideration as well as protection of Indigenous knowledge. So this slide demonstrates key deliverables and key opportunities for Indigenous participation in the integrated assessment process. So these are where Indigenous communities can influence the process and ensure that their interests are being considered. As you can see, there's several products throughout the assessment at every stage. And so for the purpose of today, I'll just be highlighting a few, but for submissions that are led by proponents, they're in green here on the slide, such as the initial project description and the impact statement. We strongly encourage proponents to consult impacted Indigenous nations and communities when drafting these products, and proponents are especially encouraged to collaborate with Indigenous groups when writing their section of the impact statement related to how the project may impact the rights and interests of Indigenous people. So during the planning phase, Indigenous nations and communities have the opportunity to participate in the drafting of the tailored impact statement guidelines section, specifically on Indigenous rights, as well as early drafts of the Indigenous engagement and partnership plan are of course shared with all potentially impacted nations and communities for their own input. Then during the impact assessment phase, led by the integrated review panel, and in its preparation of the impact assessment report, it needs to contain its conclusions, recommendations, and draft conditions following the completion of the public hearing. And these recommendations must reflect consideration of the project's potential impacts on Indigenous people, their rights, and communities have the opportunity to draft these sections themselves as well. Of course, as we've talked about today and Mina really highlighted, throughout the process, the agency and the review panel, as well as Cabinet, would also take into account potential Indigenous-led assessment processes and would consider any adverse impacts on the rights of Indigenous people in their recommendations and decision-making. So then finally, following the decision phase, if the project is successful, CNSC will take over regulatory oversight and lead the follow-up and monitoring activities at the site, often in collaboration with local Indigenous nations and communities. I'm gonna have a sip of water, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So some efforts that we've been applying to find efficiencies. So first off, the goal of integrated assessments was and continues to be to create a single efficient process that meets the requirements under both the Impact Assessment Act and the Nuclear Safety Control Act. And in itself, integrated assessments are an efficiency compared to having 2 separate processes. So that said, we've been creative and trying to find more ways to make the process more efficient once a proponent enters into it. So this work includes starting engagement with stakeholders well in advance of the initial project description in this pre-planning phase. And so this is to raise awareness about our integrated roles as nuclear regulators. And this has been a really fun part of my job, and our team has been getting really creative about how we are engaging the public and communities. We've shown up at arenas, we have been in high school classrooms, we've been to municipal council meetings before initial project descriptions, really just to prepare folks to highlight opportunities for public participation. And our consultation teams have been meeting with Indigenous communities early on as well. So other efficiencies include creating an integrated tailored impact statement guidelines template for nuclear reactor projects, which includes both the information requirements under the Impact Assessment Act and the licensing regulations under the Nuclear Safety Control Act for a license to prepare site. So the integrated TISG template provides more certainty for proponents on what information and studies they will be required to provide in their impact statements, as well as removes duplicative requirements and reviews. So the integrated guidelines also make it easier for stakeholders to read, as they will be one coherent document instead of two separate documents. I should note here that project-specific tailored TISGs will continue to be issued for each project during the planning phase. We've also been preparing federal review teams, so scientists from Environment Canada, DFO, I have colleagues from ISC here, in advance of the planning phase, because we want them to have an early line of sight on upcoming projects to ensure adequate resources are available to participate in the process. I gotta hurry up. So here we recognize that nuclear readiness is going to be industry readiness is going to be another key to the success of an efficient process. And so we've been reinforcing with proponents that in order to achieve the 3-year target, we expect clear descriptions of projects, including timelines, submissions of high quality information, which explain uncertainties and operating rationale. It's also important to create strong relationships with the public and Indigenous people, and to address concerns early on in order to have community support to proceed. And we've been encouraging proponents that they should be identifying early if any potentially impacted Indigenous nations or communities want to carry out Indigenous-led assessments, and be working with them in the pre-planning phase. So I have 2 more slides, I'll be really quick. Indigenous people have a unique connection and responsibility to be stewards of the lands, waters, plants, and animals in their traditional territories, and have constitutionally protected rights that may be affected by proposed projects. So IAC and the CNSC are committed to undertaking all of our work in a way that aligns with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and we're guided by an aim to maximize Indigenous leadership in the impact assessment process. So I think as we've heard over the last day and a half, at least that I've been with you, collaboration with Indigenous people is incredibly important throughout all phases of the integrated assessment process, but even more so to support efficient processes. Both proponents and governments need to be proactively and meaningfully working with Indigenous groups ahead of the formal start of the planning phase to build relationships and resolve process, capacity, as well as technical issues early on. Okay, my key takeaways. So integrated assessments for nuclear projects offer a singular coordinated assessment process that ensures safety for communities and the environment while removing duplicative requirements and upholding Indigenous rights. We are ready to implement the integrated assessment process for designated nuclear projects in a rigorous and timely manner, and all environmental and safety requirements for applicable licenses under the Nuclear Safety Control Act, as well as the Impact Assessment Act, are integrated into the tailored impact statement guidelines. So the efficiency of the process requires efforts by all parties, and we've been actively engaging proponents, Indigenous groups, and the public in the pre-planning phase to support these assessments with the early identification of key issues. And nuclear proponents have their role to play to support this target by conducting early and meaningful engagement, by identifying and resolving issues early on, and by providing timely, quality submissions with the required information and studies. So, thank you.
Thank you, Claire and Kendra. Thanks for sharing such a great presentation of how integrated your organizations are and sharing some of those processes on these projects that keep coming up with nuclear. So it's great to hear. I'm going to open it up. I know we're a little close to lunch. So if anyone would like to come and ask any questions of our speakers, please come to the microphone. And we are happy to answer those.
Hi. I guess this is probably mostly for Robert, but also for the rest of the panel. I'm going to stop touching the microphone, sorry. We've talked a lot about the modernization and changes to the regulations, and a lot of that seems to be narrowing and streamlining and removing things from the process. So I find it really interesting that we've had a proponent presentation where they're not required to do all that stuff and they've chosen to. I think we sort of saw something along those lines yesterday. So I see those sort of as a conflict, not a conflict, but like if we're trying to streamline things to make things go faster, but people are saying, well, we still want to do them. I kind of feel like maybe we're not all on the same page. So I don't know if that's something that you think is project specific for that project, or if it's just that was a good proponent, or I guess where would you recommend for other proponents, where would you choose to go above and beyond versus just doing what's required?
In that case, they wanted to, like, as I mentioned, they wanted to go above and beyond because they felt it was important. They felt that the existing permitting process did not address environmental concerns. And they had a very proactive VP of Environment who wanted to make sure that they were doing things the right way. They could have, like you said, they could have easily just gone with the normal route. I think it's important when you have projects like that that are new, present a number of different challenges that people maybe not have been used to or we haven't seen in the past, to be more focused and more intentional with the EAs and their approach. You know, there might be some room for streamlining where there's known mitigation measures, the effects are well known, the mitigation measures are well known, their management plans are in place. But I think for novel and unique projects, it makes sense to do more, to do better.
All right, we got question number 2.
I actually think Hatch was really bold and avant-garde to go above and beyond. So I think that's a good thing. However, I do have a question for you. I was intrigued when you did your assessments. There's a line in your slide that talked about the loss of land for cultural ceremonies. There was a line in reference to that. Did you guys think about providing an alternative area that communities could then practice their ceremonies or their spiritual needs or whatever?
They worked with the Wabanaki Nation to identify those areas and set some aside, yes. It was, like I mentioned, was a greenfield site. So they were practicing on that site, and it was one of the first things they said is like, hey, we're going to lose this. It's very close to our community, and I know they're working together with them to identify alternatives and so that can continue that transfer of knowledge that they want.
See, if you hadn't done the assessment, you would not have known that. So I think it's, I mean, you weren't required to, but I think it's prudent. So I think that's good. Thank you.
All right. Maybe just, I'm curious kind of to hear about some of the nuclear projects that may have followed the process that you went over today. Just wondering if you could speak to sort of how that's gone, that integration. Heard some nice examples, but it would be great to hear a few more notes on that.
Yeah, so as Kendra mentioned at the beginning, we just have one current nuclear project that's within our system during the planning phase, and that's the Bruce C nuclear project on the coast of Lake Huron in the municipality of Kincardine. So we're just, the first public comment period will end on Monday, so still have time if you'd like to submit comments. And I think it's been, it's the first time we're implementing this integrated assessment. I think it's been a learning process for all of us so far, but I think that it is paving the way for future assessments. And I think that, I think without speaking specifically to this particular project, I think that we're seeing that the criteria that I laid out in the project of having kind of that precondition or criteria as we recommend for proponents of early meaningful engagement and working on key issues early on before you enter into the planning phase. I think that'll support future projects and proponents enter in a bit more smoothly, I could say. So yeah. I don't know if you want to add on that.
Okay. Thanks. So you'll be coming back at another conference to report on how it all goes, right?
Yeah, hopefully we can have more case studies next time.
I think we've got another question here.
I think Gary was first, and I probably won't want to follow him up, so maybe I'll just sit down.
Do you want me to go? Or?
Okay, I guess, thank you. I'm curious about whether the space afforded to Indigenous-led impact assessment processes is different for designated projects than it is for the integrated projects with the CNSC?
No, it would be the same. So there is that space for Indigenous-led assessments, and I think as Mina also explained earlier, that can take many different shapes. So up to the communities of whether they would like to work in part with us through our process and feed in at different areas, or if they want to carry their own Indigenous-led assessment, and then that would be provided directly to Governor and Council at the end for their consideration.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Gary?
Okay, thank you. So we've heard other knowledge keepers and community members talk about the need for understanding treaties and the rights of Indigenous people. We just heard a person come up and say, have we looked at purchasing other spaces for Indigenous people to move their spirituality to over there? Does that make constitutional sense of what's happening? Right, that's like me saying, you get to still live in your house, but I'm going to take off the roof, but you're still supposed to flourish in there and do that. And be you, be your family, act like you normally do without a roof in a Canadian winter. That is not meaningful relationships. That's not meaningful partnerships. That's not following the treaty. That's actually colonization. My question is, though, I've been doing this now 30 years. I'm 43. I started when I was under 16 doing this work. Everything everybody talked about so far is the same stuff I heard 25 years ago. So what is something innovative settlers are trying to do to make a meaningful relationship with us? Because you haven't done anything. So I challenge you all to do actually something more meaningful than actually just a PowerPoint slide. This is what you should be doing. What is the legal consequence for you not fulfilling these obligations you have? That's the question I have to everybody.
And that's something that I think everyone in this room is working towards. I'm not sure if any on the panel want to comment on that specifically in their area of their presentation.
I would just add, thank you. I think that is something that we are challenged with every day, and I hope to see more progress made as well in our area of work. I think something that I take optimism from is some past examples of how Indigenous communities have been included, and especially in the review panel hearing processes. We have community-focused hearings and their opportunities. I think there was a great comment yesterday about how is the spirituality of the land incorporated into assessments, and I've seen examples of submissions made in these hearings that are unlike anything that you would see in a report. There can be, I've seen submissions from Indigenous youth, like video YouTube submissions talking about their connections to the land. And I've seen even photos. I'm thinking of the example from Roberts Bank Terminal 2. There's a submission from the Tulalip tribes. And it's a super powerful photo of the tribe on the ocean in their canoe, and there's an orca next to them, and they're reaching out and touching it, and it's a photo that conveys a relationship that no report or somebody's slideshow presentation could ever capture. And so opening spaces for different kinds of examples of these impacts and the relationships, I think that's in one way that we're working on, but I agree with you. I think there's an immense amount of work still left to be done. Thanks.
All right. And another question.
It's not a question. I'm hoping that it's a takeaway. I think this conversation has been really useful, and I think trying to create the conversations and the spaces for learning is really the kind of the fundamental thing that we're trying to achieve with the conference. And so one of the things that I wanted to just share with everyone, if you want to do a bit of further reading, is in Mina's presentation, she mentioned a number of case studies, and I just wanted to say that on this University of British Columbia website, those case studies are actually written about, so there are papers on them, so you can get a lot more detail about them. And similar to what Claire was sharing, those are pieces of work done by the communities in relation to projects on their own land, and so hopefully we can all continue to learn. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks everyone. All right, I think we're gonna turn to lunch, which I'm sure everyone's, I'll hand it over to Catherine.
Thanks all. You're like really behind today, but thanks for our panel. Thank you, Catherine, and thanks everybody. We've got another little Slido for everybody to participate in. Perfect. There we go. There we go. So if you guys want to scan this one, the question, and you can scan this one on this slide so you can see the question too. The next one we would like you to submit is, which is the most recent assessment that you've been working on and for whom? So that'll be an interesting one. We'll sort of get a pulse for the room to see the style of project everybody's working on. So please submit that and we'll compile and share the results. And while you do that, maybe I'll invite Beth to get us ready for lunch. Thanks.
Thanks. And on the note of time, I think we can make up the lost time by returning from lunch on time, and lunch is a long break, so that's good. I'm going to invite now Heidi to make our spirit plate and Jagatagamich to come and talk about, what's wrong?
If Slido was stuck, is anyone else pending stuck on the previous project? I don't know, we don't need to solve right now, but I think they're really good questions that are being asked, but something we can. We'll fix that for the lunch. What's that? We'll try to fix that for the lunch. Okay, yeah, so keep going back, I just wanted to raise that.
What? Thank you. Greg, did you want to add to that? It'll be fixed in a second. Greg's on it. Okay.
No, thank you for that, because we're multitasking and now we can focus. So I'd like to invite Heidi to make our spirit plate and Jagategamich to come back and to talk to the people who weren't here yesterday to help us all understand the importance of spirit and the importance of offerings at mealtime.
Boyo, Anin, Sego, good day. I hope you've all had a good morning here today, and that you're not too hungry, because I might go on. I'll try not to. I brought a friend with me today to witness all that is occurring here. This is the pipe that I carry for peace and understanding. And this pipe will acknowledge and recognize all that you're trying to do here at this time. And when I smoke it next, these things will raise up to the Creator from this pipe. And I will think of as many of your faces as I can remember when I'm doing it. Today, as we prepare the spirit plate, we should take the time to think of everything that has given up its life so that our life will carry on in the way that we want. Those plants that are there add a life energy, and they're giving it to us. And for that, we should be thankful. Those, the weos, or the meat, comes from a family, a unit. And we must think of those family units as we nourish ourselves from these creatures that have given up their life for us. We'll do the same with the plate today as we tried yesterday, to take it out and leave it for the elements and the creatures to share in what we have. And the teachings that go with this are about sharing and balance. If you eat too much, you'll get like me. If you don't eat enough, you'll get like someone else. So you have to find that balance as you're eating. If you are conscious of thinking of balance, your appetite will be easier to manage. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I was just kind of thrown up here yesterday. But I'd like you to know that I come from a day school system. And when I left that system, I went into a public system that was just reinforcing everything I learned at the day school. I chose my work to be a teacher. And I taught for 30 years in the public board in Peterborough. And during that time, I taught all the way from the infant toddler program on our reserve to grade 10, learning and life skills for those students who are not as capable as us. And this kind of work, and I'm telling you this so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm not just decide this is a good thing to talk about today. This is a good way to say it. But I want you to understand that there's many lessons that I bring forward here to share. I am a father, 5 daughters. I am a son. There was 13 of us in our family, plus mom and dad. Everything that I learned in school contradicted the way I lived. And so I've had to, in order to become a teacher, change my way of dispersing knowledge. And so if I can make it personal and drag you into who I am, then that knowledge will come out a lot easier, a lot quicker, and it'll go deeper than just someone standing up here to talk at you. When we ask questions of the presenters here, it is not our intent to embarrass or belittle. Those questions are there for food for thought, so that we think about the question long after it's asked, so you get the message without the words. And we offer our companionship to organizations like yours, to individuals, to proponents and municipalities. And it's hard to understand whether the message goes through or not. But looking out here, I see our intent. And I thank you for that, even though we're so hungry. I was number 7 in that family of 13 children. And so I was kind of the invisible child. And so through my life in school and everything, I became the invisible person. But once I started to learn my ways, my true ways, that changed. And so you can feel me here today. You can hear me here today. And I thank you for doing the work that you're doing. Miigwech say, for everything that's give up its life force, that ours will continue on. I'm here to say thank you for the people who have brought us this lunch, both in cost and preparation. I'm here to be thankful once again that I could get up and get dressed today on my own. Because we all know people who can't. And it's them who give us our strength, our deep down strength that we don't see or recognize very often in their special ways. So when you go to eat today, I pray that you nourish all these kind of thoughts that I'm talking about. And that you nourish the thoughts that the questions being asked invoke. And I ask that we enjoy our lunch and recognize we're replenishing ourselves for what lays ahead. Miigwech.
I'm now going to invite our elders and our veterans to begin the buffet, and then everybody else can follow.